On a quiet evening in Oklahoma, a young woman lay unconscious in a hospital room. Doctors believed she had been struck by a vehicle on the side of a highway. At first, the case appeared straightforward. A tragic accident. Another unfortunate name added to a long list of roadside fatalities. But those closest to her weren't convinced. Friends who visited the hospital noticed something strange. Nurses reported that she seemed to be improving. Some even believed she might recover. Then, without warning, her condition suddenly deteriorated. 5 days later, she was dead. The woman was known as Sharon Marshall. At least, that's who everyone thought she was. Years later, investigators would uncover a truth so disturbing that many struggled to believe it. What began as a suspicious death would evolve into one of the most shocking criminal investigations in modern American history. The case would involve kidnapping, false identities, missing children, murder, and a predator who spent decades hiding in plain sight. And at the center of it all was Sharon. To anyone who met her, she seemed destined for greatness. Teachers described her as exceptionally intelligent. Classmates remembered her as kind, confident, and remarkably driven. She wasn't simply a good student. She was the type of student who made others believe she could accomplish anything she set her mind to. By her senior year of high school, Sharon had built an impressive academic record. She excelled in mathematics and science. She participated in extracurricular activities. She earned respect from both students and teachers. Most importantly, she had a dream. She wanted to become an aerospace engineer. While many teenagers struggled to decide what they wanted from life, Sharon already had a clear vision of her future. She hoped to attend college and eventually work for NASA. And for a while, it seemed that dream was becoming reality. She earned a scholarship that would allow her to continue her education without the financial burden many students faced. For someone her age, it was a life-changing opportunity. But behind the scenes, another story was unfolding, a story almost nobody knew about. During her final year of high school, Sharon discovered she was pregnant. Terrified of how people might react, she kept the pregnancy hidden for as long as possible. Friends later said they had no idea what she was going through. Even people close to her remained unaware of the situation. As graduation approached, Sharon faced a heartbreaking decision. Eventually, she gave birth to a baby boy. The child was placed for adoption. The decision permanently changed the course of her life. While classmates prepared for college, Sharon found herself moving in a completely different direction. Not long after, she left behind the future everyone expected her to have. And she left with a man named Delano Floyd. At the time, few people questioned the relationship. Some assumed Frank was her partner. Others thought he might simply be someone helping her through a difficult period in life. But there was something unusual about him. People often struggled to understand exactly who Frank was. He rarely talked about his past. He moved frequently. And despite Sharon's intelligence and independence, Frank seemed to have an extraordinary amount of influence over her life. The two eventually settled in Florida. From the outside, things appeared relatively normal. Sharon found work. She met new people. She tried to build a fresh start. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to appear. Around this time, Sharon became pregnant once again. Like before, she chose not to tell the child's biological father. This time, however, she decided to keep the baby. In 1988, she gave birth to a son named Michael. Friends described Sharon as a devoted mother. Everything she did revolved around her child. She worked long hours to provide for him. She made sacrifices whenever necessary. Even when money was tight, she remained determined to create a better future for her son. Those who knew her admired her strength. Yet many also noticed something troubling. The relationship between Sharon and Frank seemed increasingly unhealthy. While Sharon was friendly and easy to talk to, Frank often made people uncomfortable. He could be controlling, he could be aggressive, and he rarely left a positive impression on those who met him. Still, Sharon stayed, at least for the time being. Nobody knew it yet, but events were already being set into motion that would eventually expose a nightmare hidden for decades. And before long, another woman would enter the story. A woman whose disappearance would become one of the first clues that something was terribly wrong. Her name was Cheryl, and her arrival would change everything. For a while, life in Florida seemed stable. Sharon worked hard, cared for her young son, and tried to build a normal life. To most people around her, she appeared strong and resilient. But those who knew her well began noticing something troubling. Frank was always there. He seemed to control nearly every aspect of Sharon's life. Whenever she spoke with friends, Frank often appeared nearby. Whenever she made plans, he somehow became involved. Many people found him intimidating. Others found him frightening. Co-workers later recalled that Frank had a short temper and an explosive personality. Arguments seemed to follow him wherever he went. Yet Sharon rarely spoke negatively about him. If anything was wrong, she kept it hidden. As expenses grew, Sharon eventually took a job at a local nightclub. The work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed her to support Michael. At the club, Sharon quickly became popular among her co-workers. She was friendly, intelligent, and easy to talk to. One of her closest friends was a young woman named Cheryl. The two became close and often spent time together outside of work. But over time, tensions developed between Cheryl and Frank. Nobody knows exactly how the conflict started. Some believed Cheryl disliked the way Frank treated Sharon. Others thought the arguments were related to money and personal disputes. Whatever the reason, disagreements between Cheryl and Frank became increasingly common. People at the club witnessed heated exchanges. Voices were raised, threats were allegedly made. Then, one weekend, everything changed. After a series of disagreements, Cheryl suddenly disappeared. At first, nobody panicked. Friends assumed she had gone away for a few days. Family members expected a phone call, but the call never came. Days turned into weeks. No one heard from Cheryl. Her family eventually reported her missing. Investigators began searching for answers. Several people pointed authorities toward Frank. After all, he had openly argued with Cheryl on multiple occasions. Witnesses remembered confrontations and growing hostility. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Police lacked physical evidence. Without proof, the case stalled. Meanwhile, Sharon and Frank did something that immediately attracted attention. They left town. Soon they were moving from place to place. New cities, new addresses, new identities. Frank frequently used different names. The constant movement made it difficult for anyone to keep track of them. Years later, investigators would discover that this pattern wasn't accidental. It was part of a much larger deception. Eventually, Sharon, Frank, and Michael settled in Oklahoma. To neighbors, they appeared to be an ordinary family trying to start over. But beneath the surface, cracks continued to grow. Friends noticed Sharon seemed increasingly unhappy. The bright, ambitious young woman they once knew appeared exhausted. Some believed she felt trapped. Others suspected she was afraid. For the first time, Sharon began discussing the possibility of leaving. She spoke about creating a different future for herself and Michael. A future without Frank. She had even started getting close to someone else. Someone who represented freedom. Someone who offered hope. For Sharon, it may have felt like the beginning of a new chapter. But if she truly planned to leave, she never got the opportunity. Because before those plans could become reality, disaster struck. Late one evening, emergency responders received reports of a severely injured woman near a highway. When authorities arrived, they found Sharon unconscious and barely alive. Investigators initially believed she had been struck by a passing vehicle, a tragic hit and run. She was rushed to the hospital. Doctors immediately began treatment. Friends rushed to her side. Everyone hoped she would survive. At first, there were encouraging signs. Some medical staff believed she might recover. Then, without warning, her condition worsened. 5 days later, Sharon Marshall was dead. Officially, it looked like a terrible accident. But not everyone accepted that explanation. And soon, questions would emerge that nobody could answer. Sharon Marshall was gone. The young woman who had once dreamed of designing spacecraft and working for NASA was now buried, and many of the people who knew her struggled to understand how everything had gone so wrong. To outsiders, her death appeared to be a tragic accident, but those closest to her weren't convinced. Several friends remembered conversations they'd had with Sharon in the months leading up to her death. She had seemed increasingly desperate to change her life. Some said she was planning to leave Frank for good. Others believed she was finally beginning to see a future beyond the control he appeared to have over her. Now, she was dead, and Frank remained the last person known to have been with her. Despite growing suspicion, investigators lacked the evidence needed to move forward. The case remained clouded by unanswered questions, and as months passed, public attention slowly faded. Frank seemed determined to move on. Shortly after Sharon's death, he attempted to collect money from a life insurance policy connected to her. Under normal circumstances, the process would have been routine. Instead, it became the beginning of his downfall. Insurance investigators quickly noticed discrepancies in the documents he submitted. Names didn't match. Identification records raised concerns. Certain details seemed inconsistent with official databases. At first, it looked like a paperwork issue. Then it became something much bigger. The deeper investigators looked, the more confusing everything became. Eventually, Frank was forced to provide information connected to his true identity. What authorities discovered shocked everyone. Frank wasn't simply a controlling man with a bad temper. He was a convicted criminal with a history stretching back decades. His past included violent crimes, fraud, kidnappings, and multiple encounters with law enforcement. For years, he had survived by moving frequently and using different identities whenever problems arose. Investigators realized that almost everything they thought they knew about him was incomplete. The image he presented to neighbors and co-workers was carefully constructed. Behind it stood a man with a long record of deception. As authorities reopened old files and reviewed previous investigations, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Wherever Frank went, trouble seemed to follow. Relationships ended in chaos. People disappeared from his life without explanation. Stories changed depending on who was asking questions. And whenever pressure increased, he simply vanished and started over somewhere else. This pattern had allowed him to avoid serious scrutiny for years. Now it was finally catching up to him. Eventually, authorities located and arrested Frank. For many people who had known Sharon, the arrest felt like a small measure of justice. Not because they believed every question had been answered, but because the man they feared was finally behind bars. Yet even as Frank sat in prison, another tragedy was quietly unfolding. Michael, Sharon's young son. Following Frank's arrest, Michael entered foster care. The transition was difficult. Those who worked with him noticed signs of trauma. He struggled socially and often appeared withdrawn. Adjusting to a completely new environment wasn't easy. But over time, things slowly improved. His foster family provided stability. Teachers began noticing progress. For the first time in years, Michael appeared to have a chance at a normal childhood. People who cared about him hoped the worst was finally behind him. They were wrong, because Frank never stopped thinking about Michael. Even while incarcerated, he remained obsessed with maintaining a connection to the boy. Letters were sent. Requests were made. Attempts were made to stay involved in his life. Years passed. Then Frank was released. The moment he regained his freedom, his attention returned to Michael. Authorities had no reason to believe what was about to happen. Neither did Michael's foster family. To everyone around them, life seemed normal. Then, in a matter of hours, everything changed. One morning, Frank arrived at Michael's school. At first, nobody viewed him as a threat. He appeared calm, controlled, ordinary. But beneath that calm exterior, he had already made a decision. What happened next would launch another major investigation and place Michael at the center of a mystery that would haunt investigators for years. And before it was over, the case would reveal secrets far darker than anyone could have imagined. The moment Frank regained his freedom, he began focusing on one person, Michael. To most people, it made little sense. The boy was finally living in a stable home. He had foster parents who cared about him, teachers who supported him, and a chance to build a life away from the chaos that had surrounded him for years. But Frank wasn't willing to let go. Behind the scenes, he began gathering information. He learned where Michael went to school. He learned details about his daily routine. And according to investigators, he spent months thinking about how to get the child back. Nobody suspected what was coming. Then, on an ordinary school day, everything changed. Frank walked into Michael's elementary school. Witnesses later described him as calm and confident. Nothing about his appearance suggested the situation was about to turn into a nightmare. At first, school employees assumed he was there for routine business. Within minutes, however, the situation escalated. Frank demanded access to Michael. When staff members resisted, he revealed a weapon. The atmosphere changed instantly. Fear spread through the building. People were suddenly forced to make decisions under enormous pressure. Rather than causing a public confrontation, Frank used intimidation and threats to maintain control. Before anyone could fully react, Michael had been removed from the school. The abduction was underway. When authorities finally realized what had happened, an enormous search operation began. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across multiple states. Roadblocks were established. Witnesses were interviewed. Every possible lead was pursued. The case quickly attracted national attention. Michael's photograph appeared on television broadcasts and newspaper front pages. Millions of people saw his face. Everyone hoped he would be found alive. Days passed, then weeks. The search continued. Investigators followed countless tips, but none of them led to Michael. The uncertainty became unbearable for those who cared about him. His foster family desperately wanted answers. Law enforcement desperately wanted answers. But Frank remained one step ahead. Eventually, authorities located him hundreds of miles away. After a tense operation, Frank was arrested once again. For a brief moment, investigators believed the nightmare was finally over. Then they discovered the truth. Michael wasn't with him. The child had vanished. Immediately, detectives began questioning Frank. Where was Michael? When had he last seen him? Was the boy alive? Frank refused to cooperate. Every interview ended the same way. Silence, deflection, refusal. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Still, nobody knew what had happened. The mystery surrounding Michael became one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the entire case. But while investigators searched for answers about the missing boy, another shocking discovery was about to change everything: the case of Cheryl. For years, Cheryl's disappearance had remained unsolved. She had simply vanished. No body, no answers, no closure. Then investigators uncovered evidence that reopened the entire investigation. Forensic experts examined human remains discovered years after Cheryl disappeared. After extensive analysis, a devastating conclusion emerged. The remains belonged to Cheryl. Authorities now knew she had been murdered. The The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred. The question was who committed it. As detectives continued investigating, they uncovered evidence connecting Frank directly to the case. What they found shocked even experienced investigators. Photographs, dozens of photographs, images that appeared to document horrifying violence. The evidence painted a disturbing picture and provided prosecutors with the strongest case they had ever had against Frank. For years, suspicion had followed him. Now investigators finally had something concrete. The walls were beginning to close in, yet the biggest revelation was still waiting to be discovered. Because while reviewing decades of records connected to Frank, investigators noticed something strange about Sharon. Nothing about her past seemed consistent. Different names appeared on official documents. Different histories surfaced in different states. Records contradicted each other. The deeper investigators looked, the less sense her identity made. It was as if Sharon Marshall had appeared out of nowhere, and then disappeared just as suddenly. What investigators didn't realize was that they were standing on the edge of the most shocking discovery in the entire case. A discovery that would completely change everything they thought they knew about Sharon, and reveal a secret that had been hidden for decades. Investigators had spent years trying to understand Sharon Marshall. The more they learned, the less sense her story seemed to make. Every new document raised fresh questions. Every new lead uncovered another contradiction. At first, detectives believed they were dealing with a woman who had simply used different names throughout her life. But the truth was far more complicated. As investigators compared records from multiple states, they discovered that Sharon's history appeared to begin almost out of nowhere. There were gaps, missing years, missing records, missing explanations. People who knew her described an intelligent young woman with extraordinary potential. She had excelled in school, earned academic awards, and impressed nearly everyone she met. Yet there was almost no reliable information about her childhood. It was as if her past had been erased. Determined to uncover the truth, investigators began tracing every identity connected to her. The process took years. Slowly, a shocking picture emerged. The woman known as Sharon Marshall had not been born Sharon Marshall. In fact, she had lived under several different names throughout her life. The discovery stunned investigators, but an even bigger revelation was coming. As they dug deeper, they uncovered evidence suggesting that Sharon had been living under false identities since childhood. That realization changed everything. Suddenly, detectives were no longer investigating only a suspicious death. They were investigating a mystery that stretched back decades. Who was Sharon really? And why had her identity changed so many times? The answers led directly back to Frank. Every road seemed to point toward him. Every missing piece somehow connected to him. Former acquaintances described a man obsessed with control. A man who manipulated people around him. A man capable of maintaining elaborate lies for years. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer one thing became. Frank had been hiding something enormous. Then came the breakthrough. Using old records, interviews, and forensic evidence, authorities finally identified Sharon's true identity. Her real name was Suzanne. For years, she had been living under names created by someone else. The revelation shocked everyone involved in the case. Friends who thought they knew her suddenly realized they had never known the full story. Even investigators struggled to comprehend what they had uncovered. The young woman they had spent years investigating had been carrying a secret she may not have fully understood herself. The discovery transformed the entire case. Every event from Sharon's life now had to be re-examined. Her childhood, her relationships, her connection to Frank. Nothing could be viewed the same way again. Meanwhile, Frank remained behind bars. Despite the growing mountain of evidence surrounding him, he continued refusing to provide meaningful answers. Detectives hoped he would eventually explain what had happened. Instead, he remained silent. The families affected by the case were left waiting for answers, waiting for justice, waiting for the truth. But the investigation wasn't finished. Far from it. Because while detectives were uncovering Sharon's real identity, they were also continuing to search for answers about Michael. Years had passed since the boy disappeared, yet investigators refused to give up. Every possible lead was examined, every tip was investigated, every piece of information was reviewed. The case remained one of the most heartbreaking mysteries in the country. Some believed answers were still out there, others feared the worst. As time passed, public interest in the story only grew. The deeper people looked into the case, the more unbelievable it seemed. A suspicious death, a missing child, a murdered woman, multiple false identities, and a man connected to all of it. It sounded less like reality and more like the plot of a crime thriller. Yet every discovery was real. Every victim was real. Every unanswered question was real. And investigators were about to uncover one final revelation that would leave the entire country stunned. A revelation that would permanently define the legacy of this extraordinary case and bring the story to its devastating conclusion. For years, investigators searched for answers. Every new discovery seemed to raise even more questions. By this point, one thing had become painfully clear. Nothing about this case was ordinary. The deeper detectives looked into Frank's past, the more victims they uncovered. The more lies they exposed, the more lives they discovered had been permanently damaged. Yet one mystery remained above all others. Michael, the young boy who had disappeared after being taken from his school. Years had passed without answers. Authorities had followed every lead, conducted countless interviews, reviewed mountains of evidence. But Michael remained missing. Many feared the worst. Still, investigators refused to stop searching. They hoped that one day Frank would finally tell the truth. At first, that hope seemed unrealistic. Frank had spent decades avoiding responsibility. Whenever confronted with evidence, he lied. Whenever questioned, he manipulated. Whenever people expected honesty, he offered silence. But as the years passed, circumstances began to change. The walls around him were closing in. His opportunities to escape accountability were disappearing. And eventually, investigators received information they had been seeking for years. Frank finally admitted what many had feared. According to his statements, Michael was dead. The confession devastated everyone connected to the case. For years, people had held on to hope that Michael might somehow still be alive. That hope disappeared in an instant. Although investigators continued searching for physical evidence, many questions remained unanswered. Exactly when had Michael died? Where had it happened? Could every part of Frank's confession be trusted? The uncertainty continued to haunt investigators. Yet even with that devastating revelation, the story wasn't over. Because by now, authorities had uncovered something even more disturbing. The truth about Sharon, or rather, Suzanne. The young woman who had spent most of her life under identities that weren't truly hers. The young woman whose future had been stolen long before anyone realized it. As investigators reconstructed her life, they discovered a heartbreaking pattern. Again and again, opportunities had appeared. Teachers saw her potential. Friends admired her intelligence. People who met her believed she could accomplish extraordinary things. Yet every path seemed to lead back to Frank. Every decision, every move, every identity, every tragedy. The realization left investigators stunned. The case was no longer simply about a suspicious death or a missing child. It had become the story of a life controlled from the very beginning. A life shaped by deception. A life filled with secrets. A life that never had the chance it deserved. For many people, that became the most heartbreaking part of the entire investigation. Sharon had been brilliant. She had dreams. She had ambitions. She had a future that looked incredibly promising. Yet the circumstances surrounding her life prevented her from ever fully reaching it. Friends continued speaking about her long after the investigation gained national attention. Many remembered her kindness. Others remembered her determination. Almost everyone remembered her intelligence. Those memories stood in stark contrast to the darkness surrounding the case. As years passed, documentaries, books, and investigations continued examining the story. Each new examination revealed just how extraordinary the case truly was. A young woman living under false identities, a missing child, a murdered friend, decades of deception, and one man connected to all of it. The story shocked people across the country because it seemed impossible. The twists felt too extreme, the revelations too unbelievable, the truth too disturbing. Yet investigators repeatedly confirmed the same conclusion. It was real. Every major discovery, every victim, every tragedy. Real. Today, the case remains one of the most disturbing and unforgettable criminal investigations in modern American history. Not because of a single crime, but because of the sheer number of lives affected. Because every layer of the investigation uncovered another secret, another victim, another heartbreaking revelation. And perhaps the most tragic reality of all is that many questions may never be fully answered. Some secrets likely disappeared forever. Some details may never be known. Some mysteries may never be solved. But the people at the center of the story are not forgotten. Neither is what happened to them. Their story continues to be told as both a warning and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are not strangers hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they are the people standing right in front of us, living ordinary lives, telling convincing lies, and hiding devastating secrets. For investigators, this case became a lesson in persistence. For the public, it became a lesson in how appearances can be deceiving. And for those who remember Sharon, Suzanne, Michael, and Cheryl, it became something else entirely. A reminder of lives that deserved better. Lives that should have had different endings. Lives that continue to be remembered long after the investigation itself became history. And that is what makes this case so unforgettable. Not the headlines, not the twists, not even the shocking revelations, but the people whose lives were forever changed by them. The people at the heart of a story that remains almost impossible to believe. And yet, every word of it happened. Epilogue. Even decades after the investigation began, the case continues to fascinate criminologists, journalists, and true crime researchers. Many of them ask the same question: how could something like this happen for so long without anyone discovering the truth? The answer is complicated. Frank spent years creating false identities, moving between states, and constantly changing the story he told people around him. Every time someone got too close to the truth, he disappeared. Every time questions became uncomfortable, he reinvented himself. For a long time, that strategy worked, but eventually the evidence caught up with him. Investigators who worked the case have often described it as one of the most complex and emotionally exhausting investigations of their careers. Not because of a single crime, but because every answer seemed to uncover another mystery. Every solved question revealed a deeper layer of deception. Even today, some details remain unclear. Certain timelines are still debated. Some records were lost. Some witnesses passed away before investigators could speak with them. And some secrets may never be fully uncovered. Yet despite those missing pieces, one thing remains certain. The victims are remembered: Sharon, Suzanne, Michael, Cheryl. Their names continue to appear in documentaries, books, podcasts, and investigative reports. New generations continue learning their story. Not because people are fascinated by criminals, but because people refuse to forget the victims. For many observers, Sharon's story remains the most heartbreaking. She was intelligent, driven, ambitious, the kind of person teachers believed would accomplish extraordinary things. Many who knew her still wonder what her life could have become under different circumstances. What career might she have built? What dreams might she have achieved? What future might have been waiting for her? Those questions can never be answered, but they continue to remind people of what was lost, and perhaps that is why this case remains so powerful. It is not simply a story about crime. It is a story about stolen opportunities, lost futures, and lives forever changed by one person's actions. Long after the headlines faded, those consequences remained. Long after the trials ended, the memories remained. And long after investigators closed their files, the story continued. Because some cases are never truly forgotten. Some cases become part of history. And this was one of them. A story filled with secrets. A story filled with tragedy. A story filled with twists that seemed impossible to believe. Yet every investigation, every document, and every discovery led to the same conclusion. The truth was far stranger than fiction. And that truth continues to echo to this day. Final thoughts. Even after everything investigators uncovered, some questions still remain unanswered. What exactly happened during Sharon's final hours? How much of Frank's story was true? Were there secrets he carried to the very end? Those questions continue to haunt the people who followed this case. Because despite decades of investigation, not every mystery was solved. And perhaps they never will be. For many investigators, this wasn't just another criminal case. It was a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about deception. Every time they believed they had reached the truth, another layer appeared beneath it. Another lie, another victim, another revelation. The deeper they looked, the darker the story became. What began as a suspicious death eventually exposed years of manipulation, hidden identities, violence, and unimaginable tragedy. Yet through all of it, one fact remained impossible to ignore. The victims were far more than names in a case file. Sharon wasn't simply a headline. She was a gifted young woman with extraordinary potential. A student whose teachers believed she could accomplish anything. A mother who loved her son. A person who dreamed of building a future far different from the one she was given. Michael wasn't simply a missing child. He was a little boy who never got the chance to grow up. A child who deserved safety, stability, and a future. Cheryl wasn't just another unsolved case. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who should have returned home. Instead, all three became connected by one of the most disturbing criminal stories in American history. Years later, people still ask how something so unbelievable could have happened. How one person could hide so many secrets for so long. How so many warning signs went unnoticed. And how an intelligent young woman like Sharon could become trapped in circumstances she never deserved. There may never be perfect answers, but there is one lesson that continues to stand out. Evil rarely looks the way people expect it to. It doesn't always arrive as a stranger. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind a smile. Sometimes it hides behind a familiar face. And sometimes it hides for years before anyone realizes the truth. That is what makes this case so unforgettable. Not the twists, not the headlines, not even the shocking discoveries. It's the realization that every victim in this story once believed tomorrow would come. They had plans, dreams, goals, people they cared about, lives they wanted to live. And in the end, that is what makes this case truly heartbreaking. Not the mystery, not the investigation, but the futures that were stolen, the opportunities that disappeared, and the lives that never got the chance they deserved. Some stories end with justice, some end with answers. This story ended with both answers and heartbreak, and even now, decades later, it remains one of the most chilling reminders of how dangerous a single person can be when deception becomes a way of life. Because while many mysteries eventually fade from memory, some never do. And this is one of them.